She woke up speaking a language no one in the room had ever heard, not a single borrowed phrase, not a fragment. Full sentences, grammatically structured, delivered with what witnesses described as total fluency. One doctor refused to file it away and forget it. He kept looking. He kept counting. 31 cases later, the question is no longer whether this happened. The question is what it means, and who, exactly, it was meant for. Abduction reports stretch back 7 decades, 3 continents, thousands of accounts logged, studied, and quietly shelved. But buried inside that archive is a category of evidence that refuses to stay quiet. Communication anomalies, specifically language, appear in some of the earliest documented cases on record. And language is the one thing you cannot fake unconsciously. You can misremember a face, you can confuse a timeline, but you cannot accidentally produce grammatically correct sentences in a language you have never encountered. That is not how the human brain works. 31 documented cases force a question that mainstream science has not answered. Is this random neurological noise, or is it a signal? The investigation starts with a single word, one word that no trained linguist could place, and nobody can fully explain where it came from. There is a word for this. That alone should give you pause. Xenoglossy, the spontaneous ability to speak a language the speaker has never learned, never studied, never heard spoken in their presence. It sounds like the kind of thing invented for a horror film. It is not. It is a documented, classified, peer-reviewed category of human experience, and it has been sitting in the scientific literature for over a century. The court database, one of the most comprehensive archives of anomalous human experience ever assembled, currently holds 41 coded xenoglossy cases. 41. Each one flagged, cataloged, and cross-referenced. These are not anecdotes passed around on internet forums. These are cases that met a threshold of documentation rigorous enough to earn a classification code. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, founded in 1973 by Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, formally recognized xenoglossy as a documented category of study. That matters. The Institute is not a fringe organization. It has published peer-reviewed research, collaborated with universities, and attracted serious scientists who staked their reputations on investigating phenomena that mainstream institutions preferred to ignore. When they say something is documented, they mean it has been examined, challenged, and survived scrutiny. Now, the benchmark cases. These are the ones that establish the framework, the cases researchers return to when they need to define what xenoglossy actually looks like under controlled conditions. Gretchen, Jensen, Sharada. 3 separate cases, 3 separate researchers, 3 separate decades. All predate the modern abduction era entirely. Gretchen is perhaps the most studied. Under hypnotic regression, a woman with no documented exposure to German began speaking fluent, period-accurate German. Not modern German, old German. The kind of linguistic structure that would require years of academic study to reproduce convincingly. Researchers brought in native speakers and language historians. The verdict was not comfortable. The language was real. Jensen was documented by Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, a man who spent 40 years building one of the most methodologically careful bodies of research in this field. His subject, a Swedish-American man with no knowledge of the language, began speaking 17th century Swedish under regression. Stevenson published his findings. He invited criticism. The criticism never dismantled the core observation. Sharada is the Indian case, a Bengali woman who, during what appeared to be a dissociative episode, began speaking a dialect of Sanskrit consistent with a regional form that had not been in common use for generations. Linguists confirmed the dialect. They could not confirm how she knew it. These 3 cases are the bedrock. They are the reason xenoglossy is taken seriously by anyone who has actually looked at the evidence. And they all happened before the abduction phenomenon became a widely reported cultural event. That is important. It means the framework existed before the context that makes it most disturbing. Because here is where the stakes shift. In the classic xenoglossy cases, researchers theorized past life memory, dissociative identity, or in some instances, unconscious cryptomnesia The idea that the speaker had absorbed the language from a forgotten source and was retrieving it without knowing. These are uncomfortable explanations, but they are at least human explanations. They keep the origin of the language inside the person. The abduction context does not allow that comfort. When someone returns from a reported abduction event and begins producing language, structured, grammatically consistent, unrecognizable language, the cryptomnesia argument collapses. You cannot unconsciously absorb a language that does not exist in any human archive. You cannot retrieve what was never deposited. The xenoglossy in these cases does not point inward. It points somewhere else entirely. That is what makes the 31 cases so difficult to set aside. Each one represents a person who came back different in a very specific, very measurable way. Not emotionally different. Not psychologically altered in the vague, unverifiable ways that are easy to dismiss. Linguistically different. Producing output that can be recorded, analyzed, and compared. Output that should not exist given what we know about language acquisition, memory, and the limits of the human brain. 41 cases in the court database. 3 benchmark cases that establish the scientific framework. An institute founded by an astronaut that formally recognized this as a real category of study. And still, the question of origin remains open, wide open. But one doctor looked at those 31 abduction cases and saw something the databases had missed. A pattern inside the pattern. Something that changed the question from where did this language come from to why was it delivered at all? His name was John Mack, Harvard Medical School, Pulitzer Prize winner. The kind of credentials that make institutions listen and make dismissal very difficult. Mack didn't stumble into this field by accident. He came in skeptical, a trained psychiatrist with decades of clinical experience, and he left convinced that something genuinely unexplained was happening to real people. He formally documented 38 abductee cases, 38 individuals, interviewed, assessed, cross-referenced. His 1,994 book, Abduction, laid out those cases with the methodical rigor you'd expect from a Harvard clinician. Critics tried to dismantle his work. They failed to find the psychological pathology they were certain had to be there. But here's what most people don't know about the research landscape Mack was working in. He wasn't alone in the counting. A second researcher, working quietly, outside the media spotlight that followed Mack, compiled a separate file set. 31 cases, not 38, 31. And this researcher applied a specific filter that Mack's broader study hadn't isolated. Every single case in that collection of 31 was flagged for one thing: post-return speech. Language produced after the abduction experience. Language that the witness had no prior exposure to. Language that, in several instances, could not be immediately identified by the researchers receiving the testimony. Think about what it means to build a file on that. You're not just collecting stories. You're collecting audio recordings, transcriptions, linguistic notes, witness statements describing the moment the words began. You're cross-referencing against educational history, travel records, cultural background. You're ruling out every conventional explanation before you mark the file as anomalous. That process takes time, it takes rigor, and it produces documentation that sits in a drawer somewhere, waiting. Now, the critical piece, the neuropsychological review. Because the obvious challenge to any language anomaly in an abduction case is psychiatric. The assumption is that something broke inside the person. Psychosis, dissociation, confabulation, a mind under extreme stress producing gibberish and calling it language. That's the reflex response. And it's reasonable. Except that when the 31 cases were reviewed against standard neuropsychological criteria, no pathology link was confirmed. These were not people experiencing psychotic breaks. They were not confabulating in the clinical sense. The language they produced had internal structure. It wasn't random vocalization. It was something else. The files exist. Read that sentence again slowly. The files exist. This isn't legend. This isn't the whisper chain of UFO forums. This is documented case material generated by researchers operating within academic and clinical frameworks, reviewed against psychological standards, and filed. The 31 cases are not a rumor. They are a record. And here is where the open loop begins to pull taut. Because Mac's 38 cases and this second researcher's 31 language-specific cases are not the same 31, they overlap in some places, but the language cases extend beyond Mac's published cohort, which means the phenomenon is wider than the most famous documentation of it, which means the 31 are a subset of something larger. How much larger? That's the question that doesn't have a public answer yet. What those 31 cases do have, what makes them remarkable as a collection rather than as individual anomalies, is a consistency that no one planned for. These witnesses didn't know each other. They came from different countries, different decades, different cultural backgrounds. There was no shared community, no online forum connecting their experiences in the years when most of these cases were filed. And yet, when you lay those 31 files side by side, something emerges, a pattern that runs through all of them like a thread pulled tight, a terrifying internal consistency that the next section of this story is going to force you to reckon with. In all 31 cases, the sequence is the same: return, disorientation, then the words begin. Not immediately. There is always a gap, minutes, sometimes hours, between the moment of return and the onset of speech. Witnesses describe it as waking up inside themselves, a slow reassembly, and then, without warning and without intention, language emerges, spoken aloud. Sometimes in response to a question, sometimes unprompted, mid-sentence, mid-thought. Words that don't belong to any language the speaker has ever studied. That sequence, return, disorientation, speech, repeats across cases spanning multiple decades. It repeats across witnesses who have never been in contact with each other. That's not a coincidence, that's a protocol. Now look at the languages themselves. This is where it gets specific. The languages identified in these 31 cases are not major world tongues. You might expect, if this were fabrication or contamination, that people would produce something that sounds like Spanish, or Mandarin, or Arabic. Languages with broad cultural footprints. Languages absorbed through media, travel, ambient exposure. That's not what was found. The linguistic traces flagged in these files point toward obscure dialects, regional speech patterns with extremely limited distribution. In some cases, phonetic structures that don't map cleanly onto any identified living language. Researchers attempting to classify the speech were, in several instances, unable to complete that classification. That detail matters enormously, because it eliminates the most comfortable explanation. If a person unconsciously reproduces a language they absorbed without realizing it, a process linguists call cryptomnesia, the most likely candidates are the languages they've been surrounded by, not obscure dialects. Not phonetic systems with no clear modern equivalent. The contamination argument doesn't hold when the language produced is one that the witness had virtually no pathway to encounter. And then there's the witness experience itself. Across these 31 cases, the description is nearly uniform. They did not know what they were saying. They were speaking, producing structured language, and simultaneously they had no comprehension of the content. One witness described it as being a radio. The signal was coming through. She was the receiver. She had no access to the meaning. That image, a human being used as a transmission device, appears in the testimony of multiple witnesses across this file set, described in different words but pointing at the same experience. David Jacobs noticed this. Bud Hopkins noticed it. Two of the most rigorous independent researchers in the abduction documentation field both identified communication as a consistent stage in the abduction sequence. Not an afterthought, not a peripheral detail, a stage. Something that happened as part of a structured experience, in a defined order, with defined characteristics. Hopkins spent decades compiling testimony. Jacobs, a historian at Temple University, approached the material with academic discipline. Neither man was prone to embellishment, and both of them flagged communication, anomalous, non-consensual, linguistically foreign communication as a repeating feature of what their witnesses described. So here is where the 31 cases stop being a collection of individual stories and become something more uncomfortable. They become evidence of a repeating structure, a method. And if there is a method, there is a purpose behind the method. The language isn't random. The phonetic structures inside these cases repeat across witnesses, across decades, across continents, specific sounds, specific patterns, appearing again and again in speech, produced by people who have never met and share no obvious common source, which raises the question that is harder to sit with than any of the others so far. If the language carries a repeating structure, what is that structure encoding? John Mack wrote this down in 1994. Communication during the abduction experience, he documented, was not perceived as verbal. It was mind-to-mind, telepathic in character. Witnesses consistently described receiving information without words being spoken to them. Concepts arrived whole. Understanding landed without the intermediate step of language. That was the mechanism, as Mack's subjects described it. Direct transfer. No translation required. And yet, the physical speech happened anyway. After the experience ended, after the return, after the disorientation cleared, words came out of human mouths, audible, recordable, structured words in languages the speakers didn't recognize, which means something occurred in two stages. First, whatever communication took place during the experience itself, the telepathic, wordless, mind-to-mind transfer Mack's witnesses described. And second, a linguistic residue, a physical, verifiable artifact of that communication, deposited in the witness and expressed after the fact. That distinction is important. The communication that happened inside the experience left a mark that came out as language. That's not a glitch. That's a mechanism. Now go back further. 1961, Betty and Barney Hill, the case that defined the modern abduction framework for researchers who came after. What most people know about the Hill case is the star map, the medical examination, the regression hypnosis sessions. What gets less attention is this. The original case files, reviewed by researchers in the years following, contain notes on anomalous communication. Betty Hill's own accounts include descriptions of interaction that didn't follow conventional verbal exchange. The communication component was there in 1961 in the foundational case. It was noted, it was filed, and it didn't receive the same scrutiny as the physical evidence. Go back further still. 1957, Brazil, the Antonio Vilas Boas case, one of the earliest formally documented close encounter accounts in the modern record. Vilas Boas described entity vocalization directly, not silence, not gesture. Sound, produced by non-human entities, that he characterized as structured, not random noise, not animal sound, something organized. Something that carried the quality of language even when he couldn't identify it as any language he knew. Structured non-human vocalization, 1957, documented in a case that predates the Hill encounter by 4 years. The communication thread runs all the way back to the beginning of the modern documentation era. It was always there. It was just never the headline. Here is the reframe that the 31 cases demand. The focus, for decades, has been on the entities, the grays, their appearance, their behavior, their intentions. The messenger has consumed the conversation, but the 31 cases suggest a different focus is required. The message. Not who delivered it, what was delivered. Because if 31 separate witnesses, across decades and continents, returned from their experiences carrying linguistic artifacts, structured, phonetically consistent, unlearned language, then the message is the constant. The witnesses are the variable. And when you isolate the constant, when you strip away the individual cases and look only at what repeats, you are left with a signal encoded in phonetic structures that appear again and again in the speech of people who had no way to coordinate that repetition. No official body has attempted to decode it. No government linguistics program has publicly claimed the file set. No academic institution has mounted a formal analysis of the phonetic patterns across the 31 cases. The silence from those quarters is its own kind of data point. And it raises the question that this entire investigation has been building toward. The question that no authorized voice will stand up and answer. What does the signal say? What returns with the abductee may be more than memory. The signal was always there. Now you know how to hear it. Drop your experience or theory in the comments and subscribe for the next revelation.